Kwe, Sego Annie. Bonjour, hi. My name is Lila Cashew, and I'm the Executive Director of Dehon Dogon Sodoji, the Quebec Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research. And we would like to begin this webinar by thanking our panelists who agreed to share with us and with you today the research that they do. We would also like to thank all the people who are here in the audience and who share our interest in fueling discussions on promising practices that promote research environments by, with, and for First Peoples. We are currently in Jojoge, unceded Ganyangaga territory, also historically visited by the Anishinaabek Nation. However, as our audience and panelists come from many places in the territory known today as Quebec and beyond, we invite you to share in the chat the Indigenous peoples who have shaped the land on which you find yourself today. And I'm going to pass off to my colleague, Audrey.
Thank you, Lila. Sego, everyone. I hope you had a great fall and that this gloomy weather does not depress you too much. This is the fourth and final webinar of this series, Practical Examples of Research in Indigenous Contexts. Just as a reminder, in this series, we featured research projects that were governed and led by Indigenous communities, but also partnerships between Indigenous communities and academia. We also like to feature Indigenous students who lead their own research projects, which is the case of our first guest today. I'm just gonna here. Oh, okay. So I would like to invite Connor Lafortune, who I met in Sudbury. He's a student at Laurentian University, but he's also I'm just going to find my notes and I lost them. That's okay. He's also an activist, a poet, and a very empathetic human being. So I'm really glad to give you the floor and learn more about your research.
Chimigwech, Anebojo Kanawaya, Getchwamako Indigenous cause and Nimkins Indigenous cause, Kikendan Donjaba, Venetian Dondem, Nishnavan and Endao, and Swakmakan Donda, Wimtagoshmo Jaganashmo Binobangi, Anishnabemo, and the Maget Bubama Dezing, Nanoki Endao, Shkaabewis and Dao. Hi everyone, bonjour tout le monde. My name is Connor Lafortune. Sorry, I always switch over to the English version of my last name. I am a student of the Masters of Indigenous Relations at Laurentian University, and I graduated from a double honor specialization in Indigenous Studies with Social Justice and Gender Equity. I have been doing my research now for since this summer. It has been a really wonderful journey. I'm researching life promotion, which is what I do for work. So I work in life promotion, harm reduction, and Indigenous education for organizations such as Feather Carriers, Leadership for Life Promotion, School Mental Health Ontario, Thunderbird Partnership Foundations, Cannabis and Mental Health. And I've done a lot of partnerships with Thunderbird Partnership Foundation and First Peoples Wellness Circle. I work mostly in Indigenous communities. I've been for Indigenous organizations, but even in the work that I do in more mainstream mental health fields, my titles are always focused on Indigenous anything. So I am Anishinaabek from Dokis First Nation with mixed ancestry of German and French heritage. French is my first language, but for the purpose of this presentation, I will be doing it in English. Very happy to be from the territory on Robinson Huron in Northeastern Ontario, and I've lived on the territory for my entire life. A really beautiful place if ever you would like to come visit. So my thesis takes on a different form. I do a lot of arts-based research, poetic inquiry, and so the entirety of my thesis is turned into spoken word poetry, which is my favorite art and my the gift that I offer when I teach. And so a lot of the teaching that I do for Feather Carriers, which is an organization that talks about life promotion, and we do a year-long training. You can think about it parallel with things like ASSIST or suicide prevention training, but very much so based in ceremony, in teachings, in getting together on the land, all of those lovely things that we have in ceremony. I do so through poetry, and so I decided to take my thesis in that way as well. I typically just start with a poem when I introduce myself, but that's a little bit more awkward to do online. So I figured that I would prompt you guys with who I am first, and then I would share a poem because it feels like a little bit more of a seamless transition. So this is a poem that I use to introduce myself. Like I said, I usually start with this one because it tells you a little bit more about who I am. When I introduced myself in Anishinaabek, of which I am a beginner speaker, I talked about my names, two of which are Nimkins, which is Little Thunder, which is my childhood name, and Gitchawashkumakwa, which is Great White Spirit Bear, which is my current name, the one that I hold more prominently. And this poem tells you a little bit more about who I am through those gifts that I offer. My elders tell me the heart holds all of our healing, etched with branches swayed into our skin, ode meaning heart. Odemin meaning heartberry, minode meaning to have a kind heart. I want to have a kind heart, one that blooms the way of berry bushes, the kind that carries the song in his meat. We feast on joy sometimes, trying to find the places it lives in our bodies. Tonight, I pictured a place where I feel calm, in the in-breaths of meditations, drums sounding the heart in our berries. I am coming to terms with my gifts. So here's what I know. Gitchawopshkomakwa, meaning great white spirit bear, as in he who walks in between, as in healing for the people, as in enduring the cold, the one who remembers, the one who keeps peace, the one who seeks balance. Gitchawopshkomakwa, meaning being the light let in. I want to be the light let in. I think I too am a heart that refuses to rest. And so the reason I use poetry most prominently when I'm teaching or when I'm sharing is that it's a nice form of storytelling that has been used for centuries and millennia, especially on these territories where we talk about storytelling and teaching in a way that is accessible, that is also telling the fulsome story. And so when I think of writing a research paper, which I've done many times, I think it was always lacking something. And so when I created the project proposal for this thesis, it was very important for me to be able to share a wholesome story, to be able to transport folks into the space that I need them to be when I'm sharing those things. And for me, poetry lives in that space between ceremony and storytelling. And so it's that voice that kind of carries you throughout the journey. So my research itself is looking into life promotion, how it's a transformative aspect of our communities. And if you're not familiar with life promotion, it's health and healing and wellness for Indigenous people. We talk about balance, creating connections with ourselves, our community, the land, and spirit, maintaining that wellness throughout one's journey. I think what's really prominent in the way that we do mental health for Indigenous people now is that we often talk about it through a lens of deficit. And so we're often talking about the statistics and suicide and all of those things that we are lacking in our community. And where life promotion shifts is that we are taking that strength-based approach. And so we're taking all of the gifts that we have in our communities and how we can overcome the challenges that we face, basing ourselves on what we have and what we need and how we can strengthen those connections within our communities. So life promotion is something that I've been working in for about 4 years, maybe 5. I co-created a life promotion toolkit for Indigenous youth through the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation in 2021. And that's where I really began to explore what that means for me. And the 4 essential questions that they ask when we talk about life promotion is, where do I come from? Where am I going? Who am I? And where do I belong? And so it addresses things like hope, meaning, belonging, and purpose. And those are questions that we ask ourselves throughout our lives. And often we don't have an answer or a clear answer because of those lack of connections that we're seeing in our communities. And so it's really about uncovering those things. So I took that approach of visiting and of storytelling of ceremony to my research, visiting with 6 individuals. And the teaching that I use is the McConn's teachings or the Little Roads teachings, which is something that was that I was taught by my elder Zagoske or John Rice through Feather Carriers. And it's actually the tattoo here that I have. And if you can see, it's kind of at an awkward spot in my arm, but it tells you of the 7 little roads that we have in our life's journey. And so the teachings that go with each step is what leads my research. And so each category, which is in an Anishinaabe term, we describe the journey and the process of going through life and repurposing life in a cycle. And so that is what guides my research journey. So things like doing my literature review, writing my proposals, talking to my participants, going through those motions is all described through that Mikan's teaching in a way that guides me towards the end of the life, the end of the journey of the research. So I began this in the summer, and because I'm using the teaching, I also used the 3 stages in the teaching to actually find my participants. And so I have 2 folks who are in the shkaabewis stage, or the youth stage, and they are older youth, like the under 25 definition. And then I have 2 elders who are in a different stage in life, in their gifting purpose, in their purpose life, where they are really living out their gifts and being able to share them with others. And then 2 folks who are in between those teachings, who are still picking up their gifts and still finding where they fit in their lives. And that was really important to have those 3 different perspectives. And there's also both men and women in my research, and they're from different territories, some from my territories and some across Turtle Island. And it's really special because they all are those who work in life promotion in similar fields, and I've come across them in different ways. And then that was a really special process. Another thing that I made sure to have is that the person that inspired me the most is my great-grandfather, who passed when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And I'm still very close with my great-grandmother. And I wanted to bring in his story into my research. And so he became one of my research participants through the voices of my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my uncle, my mom, and myself. And so he is one of the participants in the elder category. And we were able to sit in circle and share about his life and his journey and his purpose, and how that brought us to where we are in our community and in our family. So that was another way that was really important for me to decolonize that process of having to look at him as a participant that is not a living being, when in reality we have a lot of teachings about those lives that follow us, and those teachings that come even after one has passed. And then after all of the collection of the data, analyzing, of course, comes with its own set of challenges. And I decided that I wanted to set out 4 themes for each participant. And when I was writing those themes very, very briefly at first, it seemed like I would have many, many themes, like about 20 themes. And when I started to define them, I realized very quickly that they were all so interrelated that I ended up with only 9 themes. And from those 9 themes emerged those more concrete understandings of what it means to do life promotion in communities. And so some of them talked about the self-determination that they are trying to seek in their communities. So whether that's political, economical, social, all of those ways that our communities are rising in that beautiful way. Others talked about more traditional teachings. The men that I was speaking to talked about this concept of embodying a gichtar, embodying this teacher of this warriorship, and not warrior as in someone who tears down, but someone who builds. And so reclaiming what it means to be a man in Indigenous communities, to be a father, to be a kind human being, and to be able to pass that on to community. Other themes included nomadic reciprocity, and that was a theme that a lot of people point out because they didn't understand exactly what it meant. And the way that I understand this nomadic reciprocity is that when we were nomadic people, we would go to where the hunt was, we would go to where the berry was, where we were constantly in motion. And when we got to that space, we gave what was asked of us, and we were provided what we needed. And so that nomadic reciprocity refers to the ways that no matter where we are found in our journey, we give and we take in a way that is reciprocal. And so regardless of if we wanted to change courses and go a different way because the moose were going north this time of year, you went there and you were able to provide your full self and receive a fulsome self back. And so that was shared through different ways they are talking about community, and the way they're talking about some of them doing more youth camp things, some of them doing very political, very social change. And it was really beautiful to be able to sit with those teachers and to learn from their stories. And from then, I'm currently doing it, but I'm taking their stories and speaking through them. And so where most of typical research, you were speaking about a participant, or in this case, a teacher, I've chosen to do it from a different perspective, where the poetry that is written for their testimonies is written through them. And so their poetry is written in the first person, and I get to embody all that they are and all of what they've shared with me as a way to share their stories. And of course, this is done with consent of the participants, and them having full range to tell me, you cannot say this, or you can say this, or please change this. Really important for me to share their story in a way that feels comfortable and good for them, each of them. And so that's the process that I'm in right now, of being able to share their stories through poetry. And I thought I would give you guys a glimpse of what that might look like, just because I know that it can be a little bit hard to grasp those concepts in a very concrete way. So this is a part of a 4-part poem that I created just last year on my grandfather and his journey, and kind of interweaving my journey and his, and trying to understand him better through poetry. And so you'll see this one is told where I am the I and he is the you. But I just wanted to give you that example to have a little bit more of a clear understanding of what it's going to look like. You knew the water like the back of your hand. The body you were told not to swim in that became a warning as vessels came from a distance. Closer, closer, until you saw the crosses on their neck. There was nowhere to run. So you hid, all of you, within their scope. You built a church, a school. They brought in English, religion, something resembling a raid. You risked losing your tongues to save your lives. I tattooed your words on my body because they still rang true. I am richly blessed. I am richly blessed. I am richly blessed for all of your healing. The one you allowed in me, I can see you now, stripping Wikwa spark. Careful not to push too hard, always aware that death was a question of pressure. I imagine you on the water, paddling a canoe you tested yourself, no life jacket on, off on your deep end. I wish I could have paddled with you. I wish you could have taught me to hunt. I wish I could teach you our language. I used to wonder how words fell so hard from your tongue, how your English was as broken as mine. You learned culture like I learned English, picked it up on the road. Here, there, everywhere, always away from home. Sometimes I see your face in every blue-eyed elder. Sometimes I hear the crackle in their voice, and I think of your fire, how you said nothing and that, and counted 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I hope there is a forest around you now. I hope Natig holds you in her swaying arms. I hope you never stopped counting her branches. Parles-tu ma langue aussi? Roules-tu tes airs en cachette? Passes-tu ton temps à conjuguer tes verbes? Je ne comprends pas. La violence de se faire arracher les dents, mais on ne chique même plus notre viande sauvage. Ça m'a pris longtemps pour y comprendre pourquoi. And so that poem represents the first part of the story that I tell about my great-grandfather. And the way that I share it is very, it evokes a lot of images, it evokes a lot of feelings, and I've done it to many different audiences, and I love having the conversations afterwards of being able to share those real feelings, those hard feelings. And what's really important to me is that ability of poetry to really reach someone right where they are and take them somewhere completely elsewhere. And I love actually seeing the faces of folks sometimes thinking afterwards and relating it to their experience and being able to shift it to the perspective that they come from. And poetry is a beautiful tool because it's very reminiscent of those old stories that we tell by the fire or in ceremony. And the most important thing for me is that the way that we tell them also changes as we grow with them. And so the story becomes a part of you, but it also depending on the context. So when you read a research paper that is very dependent on the environment, dependent on the time, it is locked in time. And so sometimes it can be very difficult to take it out of that context. But with story, with poetry, with the way that we tell stories in this way is that you can take the context and change it and adapt it through interpretation into different spheres. And so thinking about sharing poems such as these in 10 years, in 20, in 50, it adapts to the context that is given, and the storyteller can change the story in a way that conforms to what they are experiencing. And so that principle of storytelling is really important for me when I'm writing these poems, to see how interpretation changes the meaning, how language changes the meaning. Not all of my participants' traditional language would be Anishinaabek, and so doing research on what their language is and how that language breaks down, because we know it's not a one-to-one translation, and also understand their teachings. I can't talk about a Dene person and then talk about the teachings that I received when I was a kid, because that doesn't fit with their community, with their teachings. And if their community was going to share these poems, that wouldn't relate. And so it's very important for me to be accurate also culturally and not having a pan-Indigenous understanding of what life promotion looks like. And the reason I'm doing this research, I'm sure it can seem quite obvious, but there are so many ways that the health system and the education system has been so detrimental to our people. And so not only shifting our perspective to a very deficit lens, but also limiting the ways that we can exist, limiting the ways that we can access care, talking about holistic care, about wholesome care that really addresses all of our needs and being able to do that in a safe and comfortable manner. And there are so many beautiful ways that our communities are already doing a lot of these principles, already engaging in practices of life promotion, whether it's land-based activities or teaching the language or doing crafts that are meaningful and have this such good intention. And there's so many ways that we can extract those beautiful things and share it as a toolkit, as a manual, as a way of sharing those beautiful stories. And it's really important for me that the first and foremost, my research is for Indigenous people, for Indigenous communities, those working on the front lines, those having a hard time, but also that it is understood by non-Indigenous people as well as an educational tool, understanding pieces of history, understanding pieces of where the future of Indigenous people could lead if we are not supported, if we don't have allyship, if we don't have reconciliation. And so both balancing this aspect of teaching and also of reminding folks of the strengths and gifts that they all possess in their communities. It's also really important for me to be able to write something where folks can go, oh my God, I do that too. I'm already there. I have a poem about an auntie, and I want aunties to read that and go, wow, this is exactly who I am. What a beautiful tool I can share with my family, with my friends, with my nieces and nephews. It's also significant for me to talk about literature that is not only research based. So when I was looking over who to cite, who to talk about in my literature review, I also had folks who were not traditional researchers. Folks like Asanabe, who is an amazing Indigenous musician, whose album Watan is a collection of interviews that he did with his grandfather just before he passed, and he would cut clips in between, and they're called interludes in the album. And if you listen to it in order, it's this beautiful story that is being told, but there are clips of his grandfather speaking, and then he writes a song about a theme that he found in it, and it goes through that same similar story. Is it considered research? Was there an ethics board? Was there a literature reviewer? There all of these things that are very colonial in nature. No, but this is a beautiful collection of research that was done in his community that has been shared throughout other communities. Other art authors like Bailey Ray Belcourt, G.R. Gritt, Liz Howard, some of which who are poets, some of which are musicians. These amazing Indigenous storytellers that are going far beyond what just a musical album can look like by telling those real stories, by educating people, and by amplifying Indigenous voices and stories. Those things are really important for me to be able to showcase the way that our people have always been researchers and creators and storytellers. I also have your more traditional research citations. So folks like Art Solomon, Leanne Simpson, E.L. Jones, researchers, folks who are innovative in their field when we talk about abolition praxis. And so this is also the concept that I'm working with throughout the research, this idea of abolition as world building. So reclaiming systems, rebuilding systems, rejecting systems that do not confine to what we believe. And a lot of folks have a very negative connotation of what abolition can mean because they only think about it as destruction. And sometimes we need to destroy something to rebuild it in a beautiful and meaningful way. But sometimes we can just reject the system. If the traditional healthcare system or the mental health care system doesn't work for you, then build your own. If it does, but there's things that you need to change about it, adapt it. If there are ways that you want to build something completely new that is different than what we've seen before, then do that. Those forms of abolition praxis where we are building, we are creating, we are writing poetry, and that those are the things that are the most important to me when I am thinking about this research. Other authors like Sean Wilson talking about decolonizing Indigenous research, about using those real practices. And that's something that I experienced when I was going through my ethics, where it was a non-Indigenous ethics board, and they didn't understand at all what I was doing. It seems like they didn't read what I was doing. And they asked a lot of very odd and demeaning questions about changing the language to making it seem, less less academic, even though my participants have master's and doctorate degrees, asking, what medicines I'm using, even though they have no idea what they're actually asking about. So this idea of decolonizing research is also important for me to go beyond just the process itself, the project itself, but to look at the process. So that's something that I want to bring into my thesis as well, of just understanding that the process is what is breaking Indigenous research. And is it breaking Indigenous researchers? Because I see it in my colleagues. Of just being able to understand that the process itself is so colonial that it rejects the implication of Indigenous research to begin with, especially in the context that I'm in. I'm not sure what context you're in, but I'm sure that you can find some boundaries in your workspaces as well. So like I said, storytelling as the method that I'm using, this idea of visiting, of ceremony. Many of the participants, we were able to do an activity before we actually talked. So one of them was going to a community event. Another one was putting up a teepee. Others, it was just like having a chat that is about nothing related to what we were going to talk about. And then like being like, okay, let's switch to that. Others, I had dinner before and after. This idea of being able to do something that world builds instead of extracting. And something that I was very grateful for. I'm a sewer and a creator in other facets, and I was able to create either a vest or a skirt for each participant from the same chunk of material. And so everybody in the research gets something that is specifically made from one piece of cloth. And being able to distribute those things is very important to me. And in that way that we are being reciprocal, we are giving back to those pieces. And so I thought maybe I could share one more poem, and I think that will bring me to the end of my time. But I thank you so much for being such lovely people to chat with, and I look forward to hearing some questions. It's hard to imagine that small horse trail leading to your solace. All vegetable and cattle and crop, dry some moose, can some fish, hide away those secrets buried deep beneath the earth. I can't imagine that kind of connection. How survival meant coming together. A part of me lives there now. When that dirt road hits my tires, I think I am home. You are home. We are home. Did you know? They paved the roads last summer. Now res kids bike on asphalt roads, going anywhere they want without being told to hide from something aiming to take away their youth. I never thought I'd see the day where we all chose to stay despite the ease at which we could leave. Your teachers only came in the summer. Too far, they'd say. No roads, they'd say. Too isolated to stay. Nowadays, the river is not the only road, is not only a barrier, is now a place where children swim. You knew people because you had to, knew how to speak to a wall and seep through its cracks, knew how to hold tenderness between the tips of your fingers and an axe in the other hand. You knew what it took to survive extinction and make it look like growth. I bet your daughter never knew she was going to be a part of history. Did you? I remember the stories. Heard about les temps when we gagano de wog tukroshik odena nui in knots. It wasn't that long ago. I can almost hear it. Whenever my tongue slips into that familiar rhythm, letting the earth dictate my words. I often think about the way you spoke. I think, si je t'appelais grand-père, dans la langue de ta grand-mère, sauras-tu me tiendre tendrement dans tes bras? Miigwech Kinaoya, thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. I really love how you look at this research initiative from a holistic, approach. Not only, like you said, a project, a process, and how you integrated all these teachings from people you've read, different sources, and how it really also embodies different aspects of yourself. Like you are true to yourself in this process. And it's amazing to see. I'm really glad that we had you today to talk about this. And I'm really looking forward to see where it goes. So, miigwech. I will now pass the mic to Dennis Wendt, who's an assistant professor at McGill, but today he will talk about the Indigenous research in counseling and and Counseling Psychology Lab, the CIRC. So I will let you the floor. I will give you the floor and I will remove myself.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm anxious about following that moving presentation from Connor. Thank you for that. So I pulled my own slides up. Is that right? I have some slides. So just give me 1 second. Sometimes there's a little bit of weirdness with slides, actually, with PowerPoint slides. Just give me a moment. I'm gonna do that first, and then. Okay, can you see those? And when I advance them, you can do that. You can see them. All right.
Yep.
Okay, great, excellent. So I do have some slides here. I don't really intend to have like an overly formalized presentation, but it will help with me with some pacing some things, and I might skip through some things quicker and take more time on some other things. As was mentioned, I'll be talking about some. This is kind of a potpourri. There's going to be a lot of things, different things we're going to address. Some broader high-level things. I'm not going to get into real in-depth with any particular study, but some broad considerations in terms of the research that we're doing in our lab, but also, when I say lab, that's kind of a common nomenclature. I really don't like that term, but our research group, and as well as some considerations in terms of what I'll be talking about in terms of critical addiction studies, as well as some broader considerations on indigenizing or decolonizing my field of psychology and academic research partnerships with Indigenous communities in general. So just to say a little bit about myself, so who am I? Following, I guess, Connor's very, very poetic presentation, I'll get a little bit postmodern with you. We have me here. My first winter in Montreal, commuting to my office one day. This was a particularly wintry day. I am from a cold climate, but not quite so cold. I come originally from Idaho in the Western United States. So I'm a relative newcomer to Canada. I came here to work at McGill in Montreal about 7 years ago. And then I enjoy humor. I like laughing, and you can see a picture here. That picture on the right, actually, I'm having a little fun with you. It's actually not me. That's actually comedian Mike Birbiglia, who everyone tells me that I look like. So anyway, having a little bit of fun with you with my celebrity doppelganger there. So I said a little bit, about kind of, where I'm from, and to be clear, coming from, Southern colonial European roots in the Western United States. You can see me, the one outside the window there, the big window there, and me in the New York Yankees hat with my little brother. It gives a little bit of a window into the world in which we grew up as in a rural background, from a working class background. I have a picture here from actually a recent trip to Denver of a telephone repairman, and the history of that in the American West, because that was what my dad did for work, is he worked on telephone lines. And so as I come from a kind of a more working class background, I'm in the first generation to attend college in my family, and that does highlight color and highlight, I think, how I see things in my relationship in I guess more elite spaces, as far as that goes. So in terms of it's been, I'll talk about this a little bit. It's been later in life that I have done more reckoning with where I'm from, and I just want to acknowledge and highlight the traditional peoples of my home roots. That's just shown Bannock peoples in Southeast Idaho and surrounding areas, and as well some interesting narratives about some key people and events that have happened there in terms of the peoples of my ancestors. But in terms of my kind of real thorough integration into Indigenous issues, Indigenous studies, and collaboration is really facilitated through my working with Joseph Gahn at the time at the University of Michigan, where I did my PhD in clinical psychology. So Joe was my supervisor. We've developed a good relationship. We collaborate on many things. Joe is from the Ani Grovant Nation in Montana in the United States. It's kind of fun too, like our names together, Gone and Wendt and Gone. That's sometimes it makes me chuckle every now and then. But Joe's quite a prominent academic in psychology in terms of Indigenous psychology, and he now directs the Indigenous Studies program, or the Native American program, I think is what it's called, at Harvard University. And but at the time, I worked closely with him. I did some work on what we framed urban Indigenous therapeutic landscapes, and that was contextualizing what it meant to be Indigenous in Detroit, working with an organization there. I then did a dissertation that was kind of not as salient to Indigenous peoples. I got training in substance use treatment, and clinical training as well. And I had a dissertation focused on group psychotherapy and substance use clinics, and that is part of my journey as well. And I do other research on the intersection of culture and mental health, philosophy of science, and things of that sort. So more recently, I've been at McGill University, assistant and now associate professor. I'm also affiliated with the Transcultural Psychiatry and Medicine at McGill. I help lead Indigenous initiatives in what's called the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Matters, a CIHR-funded initiative across Canada. I should clarify, I help lead that within Quebec, in the Quebec node of that. I have some funding from FRQS and CIHR and SHRC. But I'm going to focus today on the lab, which I helped to lead, the Cultural and Indigenous Research and Counseling Psychology Lab. Now, our lab is not simply focused on Indigenous research. It is broadly construed in terms of culture and including Indigenous research. But I'm going to focus on some of the Indigenous collaborations and work today. So this is probably the best. This is my favorite slide of the whole thing, and this is the people who were involved in the lab, primarily students, some research assistants, some volunteers who helped to lead things. I want to highlight in particular. Could you see my mouse? That's something you see? Okay, I want to highlight in particular Morgan Phillips, who's from Anishinaabek Nation, who is a senior research advisor working in the lab. We have many investigators, postdocs, former postdocs. There are here a good number of Indigenous students and research associates and assistants and so forth, and as well as others from different backgrounds. And so it's a great group, and it's a privilege to work with these folks. And so I'll just share a little bit about some of the things that we've been involved with. Here's some photos here of some of our community kind of engagement, and just a sampling of some things. So this one here on the left is with our partner Projet Autochtone du Québec, which some of you may be familiar with, which is an organization in Montreal, Indigenous-led, that is working with Indigenous individuals experiencing homelessness in downtown Montreal. Here's us with this is Morgan with Pamela Charlong at the Waldwin Center, which is a NADAP residential substance use facility housed on the Qsqbekwe First Nation in the Gaspé Peninsula. It's not managed by the First Nation. It's a federally managed system, but Pamela Charlong is the director of that, and we've been working closely with Waldwin on different projects. And then this is me with some students and others on a trip to where we have partnerships with the Nisgapi Nation as well as with the Matamakushlakjan Nation, both two nations there by Shefferville in northern Quebec. So our projects focus on a range of things. There is a more salient orientation in terms of my work and expertise in terms of addictions. However, I'm going to be talking about, and I'm very mindful of all kinds of baggage and problems with how addiction is framed, and that's part of what I'll be talking about a little bit today. But it just gives you some sense of some of the partnerships. We have other partnerships with other nations across Quebec and Atlantic Canada primarily. And I continue to have some partnership with Native American groups in the Western United States, in particular in Washington State, where so after Michigan, I did clinical training in New Mexico and then a postdoctoral research in Washington, and now in Quebec. So it's been an interesting journey for me in terms of working with Indigenous peoples that are quite distinct in many respects across Turtle Island. So I want to just give kind of a little bit of focus and thinking about what I'm framing here is critical addiction studies, and where I see this, critical addiction studies is not itself an Indigenous frame, but it's something that I think works quite well with a lot of Indigenous interrogation of addiction, of substance use, of the narratives, the stories that we tell surrounding such. As I think probably most people here have at least some sense of, it's quite common for, and this, hearkening back to, Connor's presentation. Sorry, for a second I was hearing French translation into my feed. Okay, it looks like maybe it's fixed. I don't know. Sorry. Okay, I'm not sure if that's been fixed. Is okay, maybe so. Okay, it's okay. All right. Okay. So there is so it's why as I think many of you have a sense of here, addiction is frequently seen in terms of a deficit lens. Certainly historically that's been the case. That still is the case in many respects. Aspects of stigma and shame and individualized approaches to kind of scapegoating people, all kinds of legal aspects related to this. We could talk about all kinds of things in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of the war on drugs, and on and on and on and on. And so a critical, and as I think is no surprise to probably this audience, the vastly disproportional negative impact that is placed on Indigenous peoples, both in terms of narratives about addiction, as well as the failed interventions, as well as harmful interventions. And by interventions, I mean a whole host of things, including policy, legal interventions, criminal code, and so forth. So this approach really meant to highlight sociocultural, political, economic, and legal aspects of addiction. Addiction is not simply a biomedical construct. It's not simply what some of my colleagues in psychiatry would call a brain disease or something like that. That's a very narrow, extremely reductionistic approach to understanding addiction. One that I think ultimately is minimally helpful to Indigenous peoples as well as most people. This approach focuses on structural inequities and power dynamics. It addresses stigma and so forth. And so in different ways, we've talked, there's different ways to think about this in terms of a critical interrogation, in terms of Indigenous peoples. I'm going to share a little bit more about that in just a bit. Our work focuses on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As is common with a number of academics, there's a lot of research on the impact of the pandemic on all kinds of things, everything under the sun. And that frame has been something that's been helpful frame for us in terms of, I think, the pandemic bringing to light in a greater consciousness many structural problems, both in terms of society as well as in terms of treatment services and policy and so forth. And so our work helps to kind of shed light on those things, as well as it's an opportunity to connect with communities and to connect with communities in terms of what their broader needs are and so forth. So we work with multiple communities in understanding kind of what now I would probably call post-pandemic understandings of thinking about addiction in a broad context in their communities, as well as services, as well as how services may have been disrupted and so forth. And I'll share a little bit more about some of that. And it's interesting that this term here, this last term here, harm reduction, is actually a term I'm starting to even kind of move away from a little more, is that it itself is sort of a deficit focused frame. Even though that's not really its intention. I mean, its intention is harm reduction really works very well in light of, I think, a critical addiction frame. harm reduction referring to interventions and approaches that meet people where they were at, that accept substance use in different ways as normative, and that acknowledges a range of approaches and pathways for people in addressing substance use. But I'm gravitating more now to just referring to this work broadly as simply substance use health. Another, a common frame might be sexual health or something like that. That substance use is actually in different ways normative in society. Probably most of us in this room take a substance in some way, whether it's coffee or tea via caffeine, or whether there's a prescription medication or some other kind of thing, or we do occasionally for ailments or so forth, and not to mention traditional medicines that can be talked about in this context as well. And so it's a sense of understanding that we all need to navigate our health in terms of substance use. And that means different things for different people. And there is a range of ways of seeing that. Certainly, that includes recognizing what we might call problematic substance use that poses problems for individuals or their loved ones or for society. But that doesn't mean that the solutions are scapegoating individuals who are who might disproportionately share the burden of those problems, nor does it mean that the solution is simply to stop and that's it. So I'll share a little bit more about some of those things, but also this is long, slow work. It's been greatly disrupted by the pandemic and a number of other things, which I'll talk about as challenges in community-oriented research, or any research really. So this is an article that I wrote just this is in the Canadian Psychological Association magazine. It's called Synopsis. It's kind of a fun, it's like one of those like neologisms. It's a PSYNOPSIS. And this is actually available in English and in French. If anybody has trouble finding it, I can send it to you. But it's called Careful to Tell You Tell Indigenous Peoples and Alcohol Use Problems. And here I just kind of outline what I was kind of finding in my own classes as I talked about alcohol and in connection with Indigenous peoples, and really uncovering and interrogating some of the common harmful narratives and myths that are associated with such. Now, thankfully, I found that over the years, over the past 5 years, I found that at least in my circles, that there is a shift in those narratives. There is greater consciousness about problematic assumptions about Indigenous peoples. So, for example, a common narrative in the past has been something that might be called like the firewater myth, or a myth that there's greater biological predisposition towards alcoholism among Indigenous peoples. This has been commonly held in society, including internalized by many Indigenous people. It's something that I think is waning in society's perceptions, but it's still, I think, looms large and probably among many people. And so one thing that I interrogate with that is that this myth is indeed that. And not only that, it has been studied. It's been studied and studied and studied. It's been studied by a research team with an assumption that that was the case, and they could not find it over and over and over and over again, and leading them to conclude that there is no evidence supporting greater biological predisposition towards alcoholism or really any addiction among Indigenous people. Clearly, genetic predisposition may exist among individuals, between individuals. There may indeed be greater biological predisposition that an individual Indigenous person might hold versus another, but there's no evidence to suggest that there's greater predisposition towards such among Indigenous peoples generally versus others. And I think that that's a really important narrative to make in many respects. On one hand, some might say, well, what's the problem with acknowledging, biological predisposition? But we know in reality that this is a sneaky thing. That there's a common mantra among, for example, in the United States, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Mental illness is an illness like any other illness. And the intent is to destigmatize mental health problems, including addiction-related ones. There's a good intent, or at least from among some in doing so. What we find, though, when it comes to the research is that the opposite actually occurs. There's been a host of studies on stigma and mental health, including really creative social psychology experiments where people might punish someone through some video game if they think that one narrative about their problem versus another. And what we find over and over again is that when someone believes that you have a problem that you were born with, they're more likely to think negatively of you, including health providers, than if they believe that it was because of something unfortunate that happened to you. And so this I think is a really important frame of some of the politics surrounding narratives pertaining to damage that individuals may have, both on an individual level and on a societal level, and particularly as it pertains to Indigenous peoples. And what this narrative, which I argue in this piece, is a convenient narrative that draws attention away from the clear settler colonial damage that pertains to whatever substance use problems may exist among Indigenous peoples. Even there's a lot of room for interrogation. We know, for example, that Indigenous individuals drink alcohol less than the non-Indigenous population. In addition, when you control for certain socioeconomic factors, such as income, education, there's, I think, a few others, any disparities in substance use problems vanish when there's comparisons between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And in fact, when you consider that, and when you consider the toll of settler colonialism, when you consider things like historical, intergenerational trauma, and so forth, we could actually have a completely different narrative on this matter. I actually feel that, and now you have to be careful sometimes the narratives you tell, because it doesn't mean that there's not problems that need remedies, that need support, that need, and so forth. But at the same time, there's much that can be said that in light of everything, given the context, Indigenous communities actually are doing very well in navigating their substance use health. One could expect things could be much, much, much worse than they actually are. And that's a testament to the resilience, the resistance, the survivance of Indigenous peoples. So I hope that gives you a sense of how, like, a critical addiction lens can kind of turn the tables in how we think about these things. And I think that I'm sharing things that many people in Indigenous communities already know. There can also be a value of these narratives with the broader society, and that's some of what I try to focus on. So I've worked as well as just kind of thinking broadly about ethical research in terms of substance use with Indigenous communities. This is an article I wrote with multiple, mostly Indigenous collaborators across North America in terms of addressing that. I'm not going to get too much into this. I just want to just kind of mention this kind of work in terms of thinking that, you know, along the lines of the things I've already said, the importance of avoiding some of these problematic narratives surrounding substance use, as well as working with communities on their priorities. This is a line of work that I've been involved with for some time, which is thinking about the different terms that might be used: medication-assisted treatment, or medications for opioid use disorder, or opioid agonist treatment, basically essentially referring to methadone, buprenorphine, or Suboxone, or perhaps other things like Vivitrol, or I forgot the other term for that. And so doing some work in terms of thinking of best practices and working in these regards. This is an interesting site for what we might call two-eyed seeing, where there's widely recognized need and increasingly recognized in communities for these medications, even if they're kind of like reluctantly accepted in terms of the great risk of overdose and other harmful effects without them. And so there's been some work in terms of what are some best practices and thinking about how to kind of do this in an ethical way, how to center culture and cultural healing. A common narrative that people share is, you know, this can't just be a Band-Aid on a dirty wound. As we use these interventions, it needs to be part of broader holistic care that centers the healing that people and communities need to have, but with also a recognition of, at least for now, for some people, that these approaches are helpful to them. As I mentioned, we've done a number of work on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. This picture on the right here is our work with Project Atone du Québec, and particularly working with the ways in which people experiencing homelessness were detrimentally impacted by many policies in Quebec surrounding social distancing and hygiene policies and other related things. really those experiencing homelessness were seen as afterthoughts in so much of this. We're working on finalizing the report for that now. But it's really I think a powerful testament to how this community has worked together, the ways in which they have supported one another, the ways in which they have also helped and support one another with navigating a rapidly shifting substance use terrain. The pandemic disrupted, for example, different like supply chains and different markets and so forth. And so for sake of time, I'll move on for that, but I'm happy to answer some questions. We've talked about some of this in terms of the impact of the pandemic, particularly on opioid use treatment. This was an early paper earlier on in the pandemic that addressed changes in, for example, delivery of medications as well as telemedicine. And this is what's interesting here is that, what we've heard from many providers working with Indigenous communities as well as Indigenous community members themselves. There was actually many positive changes that came quite rapidly as a result of the pandemic that helped to kind of push against, I think, some of the stigma surrounding those experiencing addiction. So, for example, it's commonly been the case that there's a lot of skepticism about giving people methadone or buprenorphine, that it could be abused or that there can be, like a street market value, or there can be other problems, addiction to those medications themselves. And there is some merit to some of those concerns. At the same time, there is what we found, I think, during the pandemic is a lot of those concerns were overblown. That as you give people more autonomy, as people have greater trust, that generally speaking, it actually helps the person to have greater freedom in their life. That maybe it's not beneficial for them to have to go to the methadone clinic every day, but instead to work on, they're getting a job or other things of that nature. So, and likewise with telemedicine, the expanded the pandemic helped to facilitate greater reach for needed addiction care, which was quite absent and still is in many communities. However, there is an acceleration now, and we're working with some of our partners, particularly through the SHUM in Montreal, in terms of that. Stephanie Marsan is an addiction physician who's really been very, very involved in some of those advancements, working closely with Indigenous communities. There's other work that we're working on. I mentioned among those experiencing homelessness, I do some other work surrounding LGBTQ plus and two-spirit folks in substance use recovery or who use drugs. This is a picture of our lab doing a naloxone training, and my students are very active in helping people understand how to administer naloxone to reverse opioid overdose. So finally, I have, how much more do I have, like 7 more minutes? Is that right? Am I right or am I off? Sorry, I didn't.
Yep.
Okay. So I'll just close with some broader points in terms of I have a friend here in terms of indigenizing psychology, but this can really be termed in terms of the academy or research with Indigenous communities. There's a lot of ways we could talk about this. This is our faculty on its annual event for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or what we call the We Will Walk Together event. So, I mean, this is something that I've grappled a lot with in my work, really thinking about my role and responsibility in helping, particularly as an academic and as a non-Indigenous, person trying to do good work in terms of advancing some of these agendas and narratives, and really thinking about indigenizing and decolonizing psychology. There's a lot to say about the post-TRC Academy within Canada. Clearly, there's been a lot of front yard, what I call front yard changes, things that look good in the front. There's clear, and these things have been good in many respects. There's been good things in terms of greater support for Indigenous students. There's been good things in terms of hiring Indigenous faculty and so forth, greater research or initiatives for Indigenous research and so forth. So there's many positive things to say, but what I think there's less attention to is the backyard. What kind of support do Indigenous students and faculty actually receive? What kind of support is there for doing Indigenous research? What kind of barriers are still there? And that's, I think, deserves much more of our attention than it has had. There's a settler colonial mentality is still very much alive in our institutions, in spite of whatever might be put on a website or whatnot. Cosmetic fixes are not enough. In my discipline, there's 100-fold underrepresentation of Indigenous psychologists in Canada. And though there's been a shift since the TRC in moving, things are better, but it's just a little bit. So what does it truly take to indigenize or decolonize psychology, or the academy, or research that we do? Really one thing I want to underscore is broader issues in the academy must be addressed. I'll share just a few thoughts on that. Oh, a bit of a sidelight on this. I co-edited with some of my colleagues here, Meadow Schroeder, Melanie Nelson, and Lisa Lacerda Vandenborn, a special issue in the Canadian Journal of School Psychology. This is important because school psychology is one of these areas that's greatly neglected Indigenous issues. And there's issues surrounding assessment in particular that can be hugely detrimental to Indigenous folks. So this is a push in. Most of these articles are led by Indigenous academics and Indigenous partnerships and communities. And so just wanted to alert that to you if any of you have an interest in that. But just a few things in terms of, really addressing, so these are things I've been thinking about lately as the president of my faculty union. And there's a lot going on at McGill in this regard. And you can see a picture of us on the picket line supporting our colleagues in law. But I just want to just have thinking about this in terms of, Indigenous research, to really address kind of university corporatism, managerialism, bureaucracy. From my standpoint, this might not be the same with others, and maybe I feel this more as a non-Indigenous person doing Indigenous research. But what I see is a primary barrier. I do complex work with communities, struggling communities that are understaffed, communities that struggle in so many respects, and yet I have so much more headache and burden and delay and so forth in working with my own university, and that is really eye-opening. And I know my university is not alone. And so I want to just draw attention to that in terms of maybe the group here to think about what reforms really need to be done. How do we really address the backyard of these things? Some of these things might be things some of you are much more familiar with than others, but simply just paying Indigenous folks for their labor and the burden that can be just in terms of the paperwork and so forth, how that ruptures relationships when things are overly bureaucratized, just the way that funding is set up from the Tri-Council, and there's definitely been some improvements, and there's more movement, and there's more capacity for research to be led by Indigenous communities. But even still, it's still very colonial. It's still very deficit oriented. Certainly from CIHR. How to shift some of the narratives there. Thinking about the governance of the university, I'm not dissing land acknowledgements, but what might be the potential hollowness of land acknowledgements at universities that are asserting, domination of their land and having really strict policies surrounding protesting or activism on those lands. What are the implications of that? What does this really mean? Thinking about labor activism, solidarity, resistance, and academic freedom. And so thinking about what can we do together, thinking about academic Indigenous partnerships, what can we do to better reform our institutions, to better work for us collectively, both the researchers doing the work, but also for the Indigenous communities whose lands these universities generally sit on, and who are in many respects major supporters of these universities. In my faculty, for example, some of the Northern Indigenous universities are major contributors through agreements from the Northwestern Quebec Agreement in terms of our programs. And then what's our duty to them? Anyway, there's more and more I could say there, but I'll go ahead and for the sake of that, thank you so much. That might be me, that might be comedian Mike Birbiglia. I don't know. You decide. And you feel free to send me any questions, and I'm looking forward to our exchange. I always have trouble stopping. Oh, there we go.
If you allow, I will do a small conclusion, because There's only Janine left. Everyone else left the conference.
My colleague has stayed. Thank you, Janine.
Oh, Janine is so amazing. Thank you everyone for coming today, and I hope you enjoy our presentations, and I hope you'll have great holiday seasons. We really enjoyed this series, Practical Examples of Research in Indigenous Context. It was a very instructive, fruitful, in my experience, webinar series. And well, have a great day. Okay, bye.